creeping through the haze, shadows dance in twisted ways, echoes hum from worlds unseen. This is where the strange convene. Step into the unknown mind, secrets hidden, twist and bind, truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream.
Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. This time we're taking a look at the controls of Stainton Moses, which, wow, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
So think of this as your own personal kind of exploration into this book and all of the kind of extraordinary claims that are made.
Yeah.
So what are we really looking at here? I mean, our mission is to identify, who are all these players that are supposedly communicating through Stainton Moses, understand what they're saying, the claims they're making, and then really, what evidence is there to support any of this?
Right.
So we're talking biblical figures, we're talking ancient philosophers, we've even got this mysterious...
A band of mystics.
Yeah, so where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, I think the logical place to begin would be with the man himself, Stainton Moses. So he was a teacher in 19th century England, and, he was very much caught up in the Spiritualist movement,
Okay.
which was huge in the 19th century. And the book, The Controls of Stainton Moses, is essentially a record of years and years of automatic writing sessions that he conducted.
Okay, so for people who may not be familiar with automatic writing, I mean, can you just give us a quick little...
Yeah, so automatic writing is basically where a person will write without, conscious thought or control. And in the Spiritualist movement, it was believed that this was like a way for spirits to communicate through the writer.
Okay, got it. So this wasn't just Stainton Moses writing in his diary.
No.
This was him supposedly being controlled by some other...
Right, exactly.
cliff.
So he would literally pick up a pen and his hand would just start moving and writing stuff down. And it's all attributed to these different entities that he referred to as controls.
Okay, and the text itself names all these different entities.
Yes.
And it actually describes them as distinct personalities.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's really striking right from the beginning, because you've got all of these different beings who are claiming to speak through him, and they're from all these different time periods, centuries, millennia apart.
Absolutely. And it really is mind-boggling when you consider the sheer range of identities that are presented. Yeah.
So, to kind of make sense of this really huge cast of characters, I think it might be helpful to group them into different categories.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
So one of the most prominent groups of controls are those drawn from the Bible.
Right. And one that really stands out is Imperator, also known as Malachias.
Right.
And it seems like he was this primary guide for Stainton Moses. He even claimed to have kind of directed his intellectual and religious development. Imperator says at one point that they, quote, thought for you first.
Wow.
It's a pretty bold statement, right? Yeah. And it really does make you question, what was Stainton Moses's role in all of this if this other entity was supposedly thinking for him?
Yeah, I mean, you really have to wonder how much of this was truly coming from elsewhere, and how much of it might have been, his own subconscious kind of bubbling up to the surface.
Right. And what's interesting, too, is that Imperator seems to have encouraged Stainton Moses to leave his position in the church, kind of advocating for reason as kind of this ultimate guide. Yeah. And that tension between reason and faith is a theme that runs through a lot of these communications.
Yeah.
And, Imperator's focus on reason, it does kind of align with the intellectual trends of the time.
Okay.
You have the rise of science and rationalism. So it's interesting to see that reflected in these spiritualist writings as well.
Okay. So we've got Imperator, kind of this leading figure, but then we also have other biblical figures like the prophet, who's identified as Haggai.
Right. And Haggai, his initial appearances involved a more visual element. So there were drawings and writing that were attributed to him.
Wiley.
And another control named Prudence, who we'll talk about later on, he actually provided interpretations for those early communications from Haggai.
Okay.
So it wasn't always clear what Haggai was trying to convey.
Interesting. So he was kind of like the interpreter.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's Vates, or Daniel, and, he's associated with this peculiar rock kind of similar to Imperators. And he was actually perceived clairvoyantly as a young and beautiful spirit. And Imperato actually refers to Daniel as a, quote, powerful recipient of spirit agency.
Oh, wow.
So again, it suggests that there's like a hierarchy or different capacities within the spirit world.
Kind of makes you think of like a company. You've got different levels of management.
Exactly.
Yeah, some people have more power than others.
Right. And it implies that these communications weren't just like random or haphazard. There's
Right.
like a structure to it, a purpose.
Okay, so moving on to the New Testament,
Yeah.
we also have Theophilus, who's identified as St. John the Baptist.
Yes. And his presence was always heralded by this distinct drum-like sound.
Okay.
So, Stainton Moses would hear this drumming, and then he would know that Theophilus was about to communicate.
Okay.
And Theophilus, he actually offered his own kind of unique teachings,
Really?
focusing a lot on Christian themes, and he would actually draw parallels between the time of Jesus and, the present day that Stainton Moses was living in.
Okay.
And he would suggest that spiritualism itself was like a new form of divine revelation.
Okay, so it's not just that these biblical figures are communicating,
Right.
but they're also offering like their own interpretations
Exactly.
of, Christianity and religion in general.
And that raises some interesting questions, right? Because you have to wonder, are these really the spirits of these biblical figures, or is this just Stainton Moses, working through his own religious beliefs and ideas?
Right. Right. It's hard to say for sure.
Absolutely.
And just to kind of round out this group of biblical figures, we also see Elijah, who's called preceptor,
Right.
and Ezekiel, and then briefly St. John the Apostle, who's referred to as Theosophus, and St. John the Divine as Theologus.
Yeah, so it's really a whole panoply of biblical figures that make an appearance in these writings.
Yeah, it really gives this sense of like a direct line
Yes.
to these, foundational religious figures.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got this group of biblical figures, but it doesn't stop there, right? We also have this really interesting group of philosophers and sages from antiquity and even later periods.
Right. So we move from the realm of like religious authority to philosophical authority.
Yeah, and one of the first ones we encounter is Prudence, who claims to be Plotinus, a really important figure in Neoplatonism.
Right. And Prudence, he presents himself as one of Stainton Moses's guardians. Like he's there to protect him and guide him.
Okay.
And he actually says that he's been influencing Stainton Moses's thoughts for a long time.
Wow.
And something that Prudence really emphasizes is that these communications should be authenticated by verifiable details from the communicator's earthly lives.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So he's basically saying, look, if you want to believe that we're real, then look for the evidence.
Right.
See if you can find information about our lives that matches what we're telling you.
Okay, so right away, that raises a question for us, like, how much of this information was actually verifiable?
Exactly.
And what does that tell us about, the nature of these communications?
Right.
Okay, so then we have Philosophus, who claimed to be Alexander Achelini, a professor at Padua with connections to Aristotle.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting because some of the details that Philosophus gives about his life were actually corroborated.
Really?
So, for example, his professorship at Padua that was found in encyclopedias of the time.
Oh.
But then there were other details that couldn't be verified.
Like what?
So, for example, he mentioned the name of his predecessor at Padua, and that couldn't be confirmed.
Oh, interesting.
And there's also this really strange incident where Philosophus apparently tried to warn Stainton Moses about a seance that was going to be problematic.
What happened?
So he tried to communicate by knocking and even attempting direct writing, but he said he didn't have enough energy to fully do it.
Oh, wow.
And then during the seance itself, there was actually some kind of unpleasantness or disturbance that occurred.
Oh, so he was trying to warn him, like, hey, this is not going to be a good seance.
Exactly. And that raises a lot of questions, right? Like, if these spirits are so powerful, why couldn't he prevent this disturbance from happening?
Right, and even if he couldn't prevent it, why couldn't he just communicate more clearly?
Right. Like, just write it down on a piece of paper.
Yeah. It's a very curious episode.
It is really curious.
And it's also worth noting that philosophers like Imperator really stressed the importance of reason.
Okay.
He kept saying that people should use their reason to determine what to believe.
Interesting. Okay, so moving on to the next philosopher. We have Mentor, who's identified as Al-Ghazali, or Ghazali, this really important Islamic scholar.
Right. And there was actually some confusion around Mentor initially because there was a photograph involved. And it turned out that the photograph wasn't actually of Ghazali.
Oh,
But this was later corrected by another control named Doctor.
okay, so Doctor's like the fact checker.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
But anyway, Mentor, he claims to be like a light of Islam, and he serves as another guide for Stainton Moses.
Okay.
And then after Mentor, we have Odurfer, who claims to be Thomas Linacre, an English humanist and physician.
Okay.
And O'Doerfer, he's actually known for having really bad handwriting.
Yeah, so when Stainton Moses is writing automatically for O'Doerfer, it's always very messy and hard to decipher.
Wow, so they even keep their handwriting
Apparently so.
in the spirit world.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
That is really fascinating. Okay, so we also have a few other philosophers who pop up, like Solon, Plato, Seneca, but their involvement seems to have been pretty limited.
Right, they mainly just offer greetings or brief messages.
Okay, so we've got this really interesting mix of, biblical figures and philosophers.
Right.
It really paints this picture of Stainton Moses like tapping into this vast historical wisdom.
Yeah, it's almost like he's having these conversations across time and space.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But the controls don't stop there,
Yeah.
right? We also have these English historical characters.
Yeah,
we
those
do.
too.
So tell me about those.
Okay, so one of them is Grocyn, who's described as having this really cheerful personality during his manifestations, which apparently was quite different from how his contemporary Erasmus described him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it seems like Grocyn was maybe a bit more serious in life, but in the spirit world, he was all about good vibes. Interesting.
And Grocyn, he wrote in this very Elizabethan style, which is notable because, these seances were happening centuries later.
Right, right.
And Grocyn was also associated with musical sounds during the seances. So sometimes Stainton Moses would hear music, and it would be attributed to Grocyn.
Oh, wow.
And there were even instances where Grocyn apparently used too much power, which ended up negatively impacting Stainton Moses's physical health.
Really? So Imperador wasn't too happy about that?
No, not at all.
Okay.
And then we have John Dee, who was this really famous Elizabethan scientist, astrologer, and occultist.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure.
He is.
And his manifestations were often characterized by these metallic knocks, and there's even an instance where a shadowy arm appeared.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he claimed to have expertise in psychic communication. And this is where it gets really interesting. He was identified as a member of the Mystic Band.
Oh, right, this mysterious mystic band that we keep hearing about.
Exactly.
And then within this category of English historical figures, we also have Thomas Wilson, who is the Bishop of Sodor and Man.
Oh, okay.
And there were greetings signed by him, and there's this really peculiar detail about the spelling of the word friend in his purported script compared to his authenticated autograph letters.
Okay.
So the word friend is spelled differently in both.
Really?
Yeah, which is weird because you would think that in the spirit world his spelling would be consistent.
Right.
But it's not. So, some people might interpret that as like a genuine quirk of spirit communication, or maybe it's evidence that this is actually Stainton Moses's own subconscious coming through.
Right. Like maybe he just misspells friend sometimes.
Exactly.
And he didn't even realize it.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, so then we have these spirits from more recent times, like closer to Stainton Moses' own era.
Right. So moving from the distant past to the more recent past.
Right. And one of the figures that appears is Arago, the French astronomer.
Yes. And he's credited with this very short but memorable dialogue about the word impossible.
What does he say?
So basically, Stainton Moses asked him if something was impossible, and Arago replied, "I do not know the word."
Oh, wow. So very confident.
Very confident.
Okay.
And then we have Benjamin Franklin, who's often associated with the sound of fairy bells during the seances.
Fairy bells.
Yeah, so these like tinkling sounds.
Okay.
And he was also apparently involved in helping with some photographic experiments and the production of apports, which are these physical objects that supposedly materialize out of thin air.
Okay, so he was kind of like the tech guy
Yeah, kind
of
of.
the spirit world.
Yeah, and he would also participate in discussions about spirit communication within what were described as different spiritual spheres.
Interesting. Okay, so then we also have Theodore Parker, this 19th century American theologian and abolitionist, known for his rationalist views. But he seems to have played a pretty limited role in these communications.
Right. And then there's Judge Edmonds, who was an American judge and also a big advocate for spiritualism. And there's this really remarkable account of his name being spelled out during a seance after he had died, but before Stainton Moses had actually been informed of his death.
Whoa, wait, so Stainton Moses didn't even know that Judge Edmonds had died?
No, he didn't.
And yet his name was spelled out during the seance.
Exactly.
That's pretty crazy.
It is pretty crazy, and it's one of those things that really makes you wonder, like, how could this information have been known if St. Moses wasn't aware of it?
Right.
Is this evidence of genuine spirit communication, or is there some other explanation?
Right. And we also have Emanuel Swedenborg, this Swedish theologian and mystic.
Yes, and he apparently collaborated with Judge Edmonds in a trance writing experiment.
Okay.
but he wasn't considered to be a member of the core band.
Right, the band.
Yeah, so this group of modern members of the band, as the text calls them.
Right, so we've touched on a few of them already, like Prudence, Philosopher's Mentor, but who are the real key players in this group?
Okay, so the inner circle seems to have been comprised of Rector Doctor, who is identified as Athenodorus, and then Prudence, Philosophus, and Mentor.
Okay.
So Rector, he was a very frequent writer, and he often acted as like an amanuensis, especially for Imperator.
What's an amanuensis?
Oh, basically like a scribe, someone who writes down what another person is dictating.
Okay, got it.
So Rector would often write down Imperator's messages,
Okay.
and he would also offer his own theological interpretations.
Really?
Yeah, so for example, he suggested that Jesus's inspiration didn't come from archangels, but from a much more undisturbed fount.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so again, we see these controls offering their own unique perspectives on religious matters.
Right.
And Rector, he would also give instructions on spiritualist phenomena and communication. But if there was a really complex or challenging question, he would often defer to Imperator.
Okay.
And it's interesting to note that Rector's tone is described as being much more yielding and less authoritative than Imperator's.
Okay, so Imperator's kind of the boss.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, and what about Doctor?
So, Doctor or Athenodorus, he played a really important role early on in the automatic writing.
Okay.
And he claimed to be the historical Athenodorus, you know, the philosopher.
Right.
And he would engage in all these discussions about spiritual and philosophical topics.
Okay.
But eventually he moved on to other spiritual work.
Okay, so he kind of retired.
Yeah, sort of.
Okay.
And then we have Kabila, who was involved in the more practical aspects of the seances.
Okay, like what?
So, for example, he would discuss the genuineness of materializations, and he would contribute to diagrams related to spirit photography and how to control the seance environment.
Okay, so he was kind of like the stage manager.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay.
And now we get to the most mysterious element of this whole thing, the mystic band and Magus.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, so Magus is a very perplexing figure. He's introduced as a member of the mystic band, and he supposedly belonged to this ancient African brotherhood known as the Marabouts. But there are these inconsistencies with his claimed timeline. So initially he says that he lived in 800 BC, but then later on it said that he lived 4,000 years ago.
So which is it? We don't know.
It's a pretty big difference.
Yeah, it is. And there's also this carved cameo that supposedly resembled Magus, but no one knows where it is now.
Oh, wow.
And Stainton Moses himself expressed a lot of confusion about Magus's identity.
Really?
Yeah, he just couldn't figure out who this guy was. And Imperator actually suggests that the name Magus might have been used by more than one spiritual intelligence.
Oh, so maybe there are multiple Maguses?
Maybe.
Yeah, okay.
But what's really interesting and maybe a little bit disturbing is that there was all this secrecy around the mystic band's teachings.
Okay.
And Stainton Moses actually claimed that he experienced physical harm from occult practices that he was supposedly guided in by Magus.
What? So, like, he got hurt?
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Wow.
And there's even speculation that there might have been a private book that contained these secret teachings. That's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it kind of adds this darker element to the whole story.
It does.
You know, it's not all just these benevolent spirits communicating messages of love and wisdom.
Right.
There's this hint of something more sinister going on.
Okay, so in addition to these core groups and this mysterious Magus, we also have a few other spirits that make appearances.
Right, so we have Chom, sometimes called Kam, who's described as an Egyptian prophet of Osiris.
Okay.
And he would communicate about ancient Egyptian religion, and he would even use these symbols to sign his messages that were kind of like hieroglyphics.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And then there were Said and Rufal, who were mentioned as contemporaries of Chom, but they didn't really communicate independently.
Okay.
And then there's Little Dicky, who claimed to be a deceased child named Richard Chatterton.
Oh.
Yeah. And he was associated with all sorts of physical phenomena, like moving objects, levitation, and there are even accounts of him being disciplined or sent away for misbehaving during the seances. Yeah, and he would communicate in this squeaky little voice.
Oh.
So it's all very strange, and, you know, it's hard to know what to make of it.
It really is.
And then there's also a brief mention of Alice Webb and an unexplained ring that appeared, and then William Callister, who was a friend of Stainton Moses, and he seems to have acted as like a spirit guide.
Okay, so it's this huge range of communicators.
It is.
You know, from the profound to the whimsical.
Exactly.
But what's also important is that there were times when spirits were seemingly invited to communicate specifically to provide evidence.
Right. So it wasn't always just these spirits randomly showing up.
Right.
Sometimes there were these deliberate attempts to try and get proof of spirit communication.
Okay. And how did that go?
So, for example, St. Moses tried to contact his own grandmother.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she actually answered some test questions correctly, but then she failed to corroborate these made-up incidents that Stainton Moses had come up with as a way to test if it was really her.
Oh, so that's kind of suspicious.
Yeah, it is. And then H. Le Mesurier, one of Stainton Moses's former teachers, also communicated.
Okay.
But the information he provided could have easily come from Stainton Moses's own memory.
Right, so maybe it wasn't really H. Le Mesurier.
Right.
Okay.
And then there's the case of W.B., a friend of Stainton Moses, who had died by suicide, and his portrait actually appeared in a spirit photograph.
Really?
Yeah, but initially he was described as being in a state of very low consciousness.
Oh, wow.
So, it's like he was there, but not really there.
Right.
So even in these attempts to get evidence, there's always ambiguity.
Yeah.
And there are these alternative explanations that could be based in, psychology or even fraud.
Right.
And one thing that's really important to understand about all of this is that Stainton Moses himself was skeptical.
Really?
Yeah, he didn't just blindly accept everything that he was experiencing.
So he was questioning the identities of these controls.
Yes, he questioned their identities, and he questioned the truthfulness of their communications.
Okay, and how do they respond to that?
Well, Imperator and some of the other controls, they would often try to argue for their reality.
Okay.
They would point to the power that they demonstrated through the physical phenomena, the objective nature of some of those phenomena, and the knowledge that they were able to convey.
Right.
But there was this ongoing debate within spiritualism at the time about unconscious cerebration.
Right, that idea that maybe this is all coming from the medium's own mind.
Exactly. And that's a question that hangs over all of these communications.
Right.
Like, how much of this is really coming from elsewhere, and how much of it is coming from Stainton Moses himself?
Right, and the text itself notes instances where the spirits gave incorrect information, or they provided different levels of detail about their lives.
Yeah, which further complicates things.
It really does.
It's like sometimes they seem to know a lot, but then other times they seem to be making things up.
Right, and it's also significant that Spirit Teachings, which was the book that was compiled from these communications, underwent revisions before it was published.
Right, and that raises questions about how Stainton Moses's own conscious or unconscious biases might have shaped the final version of the text.
Right, so we may not be getting like a completely accurate representation of what was actually communicated.
Exactly.
And then there's different views on topics like reincarnation.
Yeah, so Imperator had one view on reincarnation, but then Stainton Moses received different information from other sources.
Oh, so even within the communications themselves, there are inconsistencies.
Right, and that makes it even harder to know what to believe.
It really does.
At the end of the day, it's really difficult to say for sure where these communications were coming from.
Right.
Were they external spirits, or were they some product of Stainton Moses's own mind?
Right.
It's a question that remains open.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We've really journeyed through this incredible cast of characters. We've got these revered biblical figures like Imperator and John the Baptist. We've got these influential Greek philosophers like Plato. We've got these Elizabethan scholars like John Dee.
All right.
We've even got this mischievous child spirit, Little Dicky.
Yeah, he's hard to forget.
He really is. So I think this deep dive into the controls of Stainton Moses has really given us this fascinating and intricate glimpse into this world of spiritual communication in the 19th century.
It really has. And, as you kind of reflect on all of these different personalities, all this detailed information and the errors and inconsistencies and the fact that Stainton Moses himself was skeptical.
Right.
What does all of this suggest to you about the nature of belief itself?
Right.
Like, what does it tell us about the power of the human mind and our fascination with these mysteries that lie beyond our perception?
Yeah. What aspects of this deep dive resonated with you the most, and what aspects are still the most perplexing?
Yeah, what are you still wondering about?
Right. Well, if you're interested in learning more about this fascinating historical case, and you want to go even deeper into this world of spiritualism and, these purported communications from beyond, I highly recommend checking out The Controls of Stainton Moses and other related works.
Yeah, there's a lot out there to explore.
There really is. And thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.
Whispers creeping through the haze, shadows dance unseen. This is where the strange convene. Step into the unknown mind. Secrets hidden, twist and bind. Truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream. A voice that stirs the silent night, guides you through the fading light. Journeys deep beyond the real, where unseen forces are revealed. Step into the unknown mind. Secrets hidden, twist and bind. Truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream. Electric sparks and haunted tones. Reality's edge becomes your home. Questions rise like fragile smoke. The uncharted realms silently spoke. Step into the unknown mind. Secrets hidden, twist and bind. Truths that linger in between. Welcome to the spectral stream. Electric sparks and haunted tones. Reality's edge becomes your home. Questions rise like fragile smoke. The uncharted realm silently spoke.